This Friday, on the full episode with Jaye Pool, we have a surprise for you. The books that helped her heal, now as a gift for you. Tune in for the episode on Friday to hear her story and to join the giveaway. Stay tuned.
Her main story came first because I guess what really got me to writing that story was dealing with some things in my life. So when like so so when I was born, my parents got divorced, like basically right after I was born. And my dad remarried when I was two. And so, like, when I talk about like my parents, I'm referring to my dad and, and his subsequent wife, like technically my stepmother, but for all intents and purposes, I consider her my mom.
Okay, that's nice.
Yeah. And so, like to this day, like she's my mom. And so that's how I grew up. But then my birth mother, my birth mother was absent growing up. Like she wasn't there. I didn't know her. The only the only thing, so my parents would tell me that I had this birth mother that was out there, like that she existed. But the only thing that I had of her was like pictures of her, like just, these pictures of her. And I had a lot of feelings about that growing up. I wondered like, well, especially as as I went into like becoming a teenager and, all of that, I was like, well, what happened? And, you know, like, how can you like have a kid and just disappear? Like that was the big thing. Um,
I'm still asking myself that, and I'm a father, I'm not a mother.
mhm. Yeah. And so, like that was always like my question. And, you know, um, and then when my dad died, then all of a sudden people started to talk. So up until that point, I had heard that like my birth mother had had some issues, and she felt that my dad was the better one to raise me, and that was always the story. And then when my dad passed away, then I started to hear from relatives, oh, well, there's more to it than that. Like, well, she didn't leave willingly, this, that, and the other happened, and so there are these other stories like that I was hearing, and I'm like, well, and at first I'm very defensive because like I think I mentioned earlier, like my dad and I were really close. And so I'm like, well, he said X, Y, and Z, so like these other stories, like they like that doesn't make sense. I just kind of shut it out. And I just didn't deal with it. And then like maybe about 2 or 3 years later, I got an email from my older sister. So like my birth mother had well, actually three other children before she and my dad got married. Like so she had been in a previous marriage. And so when they got divorced and my birth mother was no longer in my life, she was still raising her other kids. And so one of them reached out to me, and then also like a cousin on that side of my family reached out. And so I got this email from my sister that like, and I'd never met her either. I just seen like pictures of her as a teenager. And so, but like I knew who she was when she reached out because I'd heard about her, but, I'd never met her. And so, she's like, and I'm like, well, how did you find me? That kind of thing. And so, so she's like, yeah, like, I found you on Facebook, and she's like, I could tell it was, that it was the right person, because I mean, my maiden name was like really common, like super common. And so, but at the same time, like, but she's like, I could tell, because, like being a black girl with red hair is not very common. And so just, put the pieces together like that, and, all that. So, you know, so my big question to her, so, she was telling about what's going on with family, and I asked, like, the big question I had was like, well, does my birth mother actually want to meet me? And so she's like, yes. And so so I did have a chance to meet her. And over that next decade, she and I like like basically built a relationship. It was like, I wouldn't say it was this like, fantastical, like, mother daughter, like, oh, we're making up for lost time, all that kind of stuff. Like, it wasn't like that, but it was a relationship, you know? And then, right, like, the December before COVID, she passed away. And yeah, and so,
I'm so sorry. I,
yeah. So, but at first I didn't know how to deal with it.
I,
Um, it was one thing, like losing my dad was one thing, because, again, like, he and I were really close. Like, he had been in my life for all my life up until that point. That type of grief was one thing. But then when I lost my birth mother, I didn't know how to process that at all,
Mhm.
because I didn't know if it was I was missing her, or was I sad about what might have been.